Hey everyone, welcome back to Mr. Not Horror. If you're ready for a spine-chilling story that'll have you double-checking your locks tonight, you're in the right place. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment, letting us know where you're tuning in from. We love hearing from our horror fam. Now, grab a blanket, turn down the lights, and get ready for today's eerie tale. Let's dive in. It started with a weather alert on my phone. Blizzard warning. Severe snowstorm expected. Stay indoors. Avoid travel. I didn't think much of it. I had been working as a park ranger for years, stationed at Eagle Ridge National Forest. Winter storms were nothing new. My cabin was well equipped to handle the worst conditions, and the generator could last days if the power went out. But this storm was different. It arrived fast, faster than anyone predicted. By mid-afternoon, visibility had dropped to zero, and my usual 15-minute drive to the main ranger station became impossible. The only option was to take refuge at an abandoned outpost nestled deep in the forest, a place we jokingly referred to as the Ghost Station. It had been closed for years due to structural issues, but it was closer than my cabin, and I knew it still had basic supplies: a cot, a wood stove, and a first aid kit. As I trudged through the snow, the wind screamed through the trees, carrying a sound that made me pause, a faint, high-pitched whisper. I turned my head, certain I wasn't alone, but all I saw was swirling snow and skeletal trees. Shrugging it off as the wind playing tricks, I pressed on. The outpost came into view just as the sky darkened completely. The building was small, with peeling paint and boarded windows. The wind had blown snow against its walls, burying the lower half of the door. I kicked the snow away, shoved the door open, and stepped inside. The interior smelled of mildew and damp wood. Dust coated the countertops, and cobwebs hung like curtains in the corners. The stove was rusted but functional. I threw some logs inside and lit a fire, grateful for the warmth. As the flames crackled, I set my gear down and surveyed the room. The station's logbook sat on the desk, its cover warped with age. Out of habit, I flipped it open. The entries dated back decades, written in the cramped handwriting of rangers long before my time. Then, I found the final entry. January 12th, 1985. The whispers won't stop. I see them in the snow now, their faces. I don't think I'll make it through the night. If anyone finds this, leave. Don't stay. It's not safe here. The handwriting was erratic, as if written in panic. I stared at the words, a chill creeping up my spine. I wanted to dismiss it as the ramblings of someone who'd spent too much time alone, but something about it felt wrong. The first whisper came just after midnight. I was lying on the cot, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls. At first, I thought it was the wind again, a faint murmur, rising and falling. But this time, it sounded deliberate, like words spoken just out of earshot. I sat up, straining to listen. Help me. The voice was faint, fragile, like a breath against the back of my neck. I jumped to my feet, scanning the room. Nothing. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the window. The beam pierced the darkness outside, revealing a wall of snow. Hello? I called out, my voice shaky. No response. The whisper came again, closer, so cold. My heart raced. It sounded like a woman's voice, trembling with pain. But it couldn't be. There was no way anyone else was out, not in this storm. Still, I couldn't ignore. Throwing on my coat and boots, I stepped outside. The cold was biting, the wind howling like a living thing. I scanned the area with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the snow. Is anyone out there? I shouted. A shadow moved at the edge of the light. I froze. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the trees, but it was there, human-shaped, standing still. Hello? I called again, stepping closer. The shadow didn't move. Then, as I approached, it dissolved into the storm, leaving no trace. I stumbled back inside, slamming the door shut. My hands were trembling, my breath coming in gasps. It was just the snow playing tricks, I told myself. Shadows and wind, nothing more. But deep down, I knew better. I locked the door and stoked the fire, trying to shake the unease crawling under my skin. Sleep was impossible, so I sat by the stove, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. Hours passed. The wind outside grew louder, almost deafening. But beneath it, I could hear them, the whispers. Not just one voice now, but many, overlapping in a cacophony of pain and desperation. It's so cold. Why won't you help us? We're still here. The fire flickered and the room seemed to darken. Shadows stretched across the walls, twisting into grotesque shapes. Then the door creaked open. I froze. The lock was still in place, but the door was ajar, snow blowing in through the gap. Something stood in the doorway. It was a figure, barely visible, cloaked in frost and shadow. Its face was pale and gaunt, its eyes dark hollows that stared straight at me. "Why didn't you help us?" It rasped, its voice echoing like wind through a canyon. I scrambled backward, my heart pounding. "I don't understand. Who are you?" The figure stepped inside, leaving no footprints in the snow. Its presence was suffocating, the air growing colder with each step it took. "They left us to die, and now, so will you." I don't remember. The fire went out, plunging the room into darkness. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me, pressing against my mind. I felt cold hands gripping my shoulders, pulling me into the void. When I woke up, it was daylight. The storm had passed, leaving a serene, snow-covered landscape, but the outpost was gone. In its place was a mound of snow, as if it had been buried for decades. I was found 2 days later, wandering the forest in a daze. They told me I was lucky to be alive. I still hear the whispers. Even now, weeks later, they follow me. At first, I thought it was the lingering trauma, my mind replaying the horrors of that night. But as the days passed, I realized the whispers weren't in my head. They were real. I'd hear them at odd times, while making coffee as I lay in bed or walking through the park. Always faint, just out of reach, like a distant conversation I couldn't quite catch. But they were getting closer, louder. And then there were the dreams. In my sleep, I'd find myself back at the outpost, the fire dead, the room filled with frost and shadow. The whispers surrounded me, accusing and pleading. Faces appeared in the dark, gaunt, frozen faces of people I didn't recognize but somehow knew. I'd wake up gasping, my breath fogging in the cold air. Even though the heater in my apartment was on full blast, I decided to research the outpost, desperate for answers. The records were sparse. The station had been built in the 1940s and decommissioned in the 1980s after a series of unexplained incidents. The official report cited structural instability and hazardous conditions, but the rumors painted a darker picture. There were whispers, ironic, I know, of disappearances. Rangers who had stayed there during severe storms were never seen again. Locals claimed the forest was cursed, haunted by the spirits of those who had died in the harsh winters. One name kept appearing in the reports: Ranger Daniel Mercer. Daniel was the last recorded ranger to use the outpost before it was shut down. His final log entry, the one I'd read that night, was written on the day he vanished. Search parties found no trace of him, and his disappearance was officially declared an accident, likely caused by exposure to the elements. But the other entries in his logbook told a different story. "They're watching me. They won't let me leave. The cold is alive. It wants me. If I don't make it through the night, remember my name. Don't let them take me." I remembered his name. I couldn't forget it if I tried. The whispers grew worse after I read his entries. They weren't just voices anymore. They had weight, presence. I'd feel cold fingers brush against my neck, a fleeting chill that made my skin crawl. Objects in my apartment began to move. Small things at first, like my keys or a book, but then larger, more unsettling changes. One night I came home to find every window frosted over from the inside. My breath fogged as I stepped into the living room, the temperature plummeting despite the heater roaring. And then I saw it. The figure from the outpost stood in the corner of my apartment, its hollow eyes fixed on me. It didn't speak, but the whispers swirled around it, filling the room. "Why didn't you help us?" So cold. Still here. I backed away, my hands trembling. "What do you want from me?" I whispered. The figure tilted its head, and for the first time it moved toward me. Its steps were slow, deliberate, and with each one the air grew colder. I stumbled, falling to the floor as it loomed over me. "You let us die," it hissed, its voice like cracking ice. "Now, you will join us." I don't know how I escaped that night. When I came to, I was outside in the snow, barefoot and shivering, my apartment a distant glow behind me. I stumbled back inside, locking the door and barricading it with furniture. But I knew it wouldn't matter. They were always with me now. I'm writing this as a warning. If you ever find yourself near Eagle Ridge during a winter storm, stay away from the outpost. Don't listen to the whispers. Don't go looking for answers. They're still there, waiting, and if you're not careful, they'll find you too. As I finish this, I can feel the cold seeping in again. The whispers are louder now, clearer. Come back. Stay with us. My breath fogs as I type. The frost is crawling up the windows, and the shadows are moving in the corner of my eye. I know they're here, and I know this time they won't let me go. The drive should have been uneventful, but winter had other plans. I was on my way to visit my brother in Vermont, a trip I'd taken every January since I moved out of state. The highways were empty, the snow relentless, and the radio full of weather warning. By the time I reached the back roads, the blizzard was in full force. Visibility was nearly zero, and my car's heater struggled to keep up with the plummeting temperatures. I had planned to push through the storm, but when I saw the old weathered sign for the Blackwood Inn, I decided it wasn't worth the risk. The inn stood at the edge of the woods, its Victorian architecture looming through the snow. A soft yellow glow spilled from its windows, promising warmth and shelter. I pulled into the driveway, the tires crunching over ice, and stepped out into the biting cold. Inside, the inn was strangely quiet, the kind of silence that made you want to whisper even when no one was around. The decor was dated but charming: faded wallpaper, antique furniture, and a large stone fireplace crackling with warmth. Behind the front desk stood a woman, middle-aged and pale, her hair neatly pinned back. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome to the Blackwood Inn," she said. "We weren't expecting guests tonight." I explained my situation and she nodded sympathetically. "Of course, we have a room available. Just one other guest staying here tonight." She handed me a brass key, the number 4 engraved on it. "Dinner will be served shortly in the dining room," she said. "And if you need anything, my name is Evelyn." The room was modest but clean. A 4-poster bed, a small writing desk, and an old wardrobe filled the space. A single window looked out into the woods, but all I could see was the swirling snow. I unpacked a few essentials, then made my way to the dining room. The other guest was already seated. He was a wiry man in his 50s, with sharp features and restless eyes. He introduced himself as Tom, a traveling salesman stranded by the storm. Dinner was simple, soup and bread, but it was hot and filling. Evelyn joined us briefly, asking polite questions about our travels. Her demeanor was pleasant, but something about her seemed off. Her smile lingered too long, her eyes darting toward the windows, as if expecting something or someone. Tom noticed it too. After Evelyn excused herself, he leaned in and whispered, "Creepy place." I nodded, glancing around the dimly lit room. Shadows seemed to pool in the corners, flickering with the firelight. "You staying here long?" he asked. "Just until the storm clears," I replied. "What about you?" "Same, though I've heard stories about this place." I raised an eyebrow. "What kind of stories?" Tom hesitated, lowering his voice. "People say the Blackwood Inn is cursed. Back in the 1920s, a family froze to death here during a freak blizzard. Ever since then, strange things have happened. People disappearing, hearing voices, seeing things that aren't there." I laughed nervously. "Sounds like an old ghost story." Tom shrugged. "Maybe. But places like this, they remember." That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the room felt unnaturally cold, despite the heater humming in the corner. I wrapped myself in the blankets, staring at the ceiling, willing myself to relax. Then I heard it, a faint scratching sound. It came from the wardrobe, soft and deliberate, like nails dragging across wood. My pulse quickened as I sat up, my breath fogging in the cold air. The sound stopped. I told myself it was just the old building settling, that the storm outside was playing tricks on me. But as I lay back down, the scratching started again, louder this time, more insistent. Heart pounding, I got out of bed and crept toward the wardrobe. My hand trembled as I gripped the handle, yanking the door open. Empty. I exhaled in relief, laughing at my own paranoia. But as I turned to go back to bed, I froze. The scratching wasn't coming from the wardrobe anymore. It was coming from under the bed. I didn't move. I couldn't. The sound grew louder, closer, as if whatever was under there knew I was standing just a few feet away. Gathering my courage, I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and turned on the flashlight. Slowly, I crouched down and aimed the beam of light under the bed. Nothing, just dust and shadows. But as I stood up, something caught my eye in the mirror across the room. There was a figure behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. The figure, a tall, gaunt silhouette with hollow eyes, was gone. I didn't sleep after that. I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the blankets, jumping at every creak and gust of wind. By morning, the storm had eased. I hurried downstairs, eager to leave, but the inn was silent. The dining room was empty, the fireplace cold. I called out for Evelyn and Tom, but there was no response. And then I noticed something strange. The front desk was covered in dust, the ledger blank, as if no one had stayed there in years. The firewood in the hearth was untouched, the room lifeless. When I stepped outside, my car was buried in snow. As I dug it out, I glanced back at the inn. The windows were dark, the building looming like a shadow against the white landscape. But as I turned to leave, I saw something in one of the upstairs windows, a face pale and hollow-eyed, watching me. I didn't stop driving until I reached my brother's house. I never found out what happened at the Blackwood Inn. When I tried to look it up later, there was no record of it. No address, no phone number, nothing. It was as if it had never existed. But I know what I saw. And sometimes on cold January nights, I still hear the scratching. I grew up in a small town in northern Maine, where the winters were long, brutal, and unforgiving. The kind of place where snow piled higher than cars, and the nights stretched on forever. It was January when it happened, the coldest winter I can remember, and the events of that night have haunted me ever since. The story begins with the tracks. Our town was built around an old railway line that had been abandoned for decades. The tracks cut through the woods on the outskirts, a rusting skeleton of iron buried beneath layers of snow and ice. Locals said the tracks were cursed, but nobody took it seriously. It was just one of those small town legends meant to scare kids into staying out of the forest. But when you're 16 and looking for thrills in a dead end town, the tracks are irresistible. That night, my best friend Mark and I decided to explore the tracks. We'd heard the stories 100 times about the ghost train that supposedly ran on moonless nights, its whistle echoing through the trees. People claimed to have seen its headlights in the distance, barreling down the tracks, even though the line hadn't been in use for 50 years. It sounded like nonsense, but we were bored, and the idea of ghost hunting was more exciting than playing video games for the 100th time. So, armed with flashlights and a thermos of coffee, we set out into the woods. The air was bitterly cold, each breath fogging in front of us. The snow crunched under our boots as we followed the faint outline of the tracks, their metal surface barely visible beneath the frost. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. Mark was the first to break it. "You think we'll see anything?" he asked, his voice muffled by his scarf. I shrugged. Probably just a bunch of snow and trees. But as we walked further, the air seemed to change. It grew colder, not just from the weather, but a deep, bone-chilling cold that made my skin crawl. The flashlight beams seemed dimmer, swallowed up by the darkness pressing in around us. Then, we heard it. It was faint at first, a distant rumble that I thought might be the wind, but it grew louder, rhythmic, like the clatter of wheels on tracks. Mark stopped, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "Do you hear that?" I nodded, my heart pounding. The sound was unmistakable now, the deep metallic groan of a train. But that was impossible. The tracks were abandoned. The rumble grew closer, accompanied by a shrill whistle that echoed through the trees. A light appeared in the distance, a faint glow that cut through the darkness. "It's probably some kind of maintenance vehicle," I said, trying to sound calm. But my voice wavered, betraying my fear. Mark shook his head. "There's no way. These tracks haven't been used in decades." We stood frozen as the light grew brighter, the sound deafening. It was a train, no doubt about it, but it looked wrong. The engine was ancient, its black iron surface corroded and cracked. Flames flickered from its smokestack, and the windows of the cars behind it glowed with a sickly yellow light. But the most horrifying thing was the silence. Despite the thunderous roar of the train, the forest remained unnaturally quiet. No echoes, no birds, scattering in fright, just the sound of the train, as if it existed in its own separate world. Mark grabbed my arm. "We need to move." But before we could run, the train screeched to a halt, its massive engine looming just a few yards away. The air was heavy with the stench of burning metal and sulfur. The doors of the nearest car slid open. A figure stepped out, shrouded in shadows. It was tall and gaunt, its face pale and hollow, like something that had been dead for years. Its eyes burned with an unnatural light, piercing through the darkness. "You shouldn't be here," it said, its voice like grinding metal. Mark and I bolted, running back the way we came. The snow seemed deeper now, dragging at our legs, slowing us down. Behind us, the train's whistle screamed, a sound so loud it felt like it was splitting my skull. I glanced over my shoulder and saw the train moving again, its headlights cutting through the trees as it followed us. The figure stood on the engine's front, staring at us with those glowing eyes. We ran until we reached the edge of the woods, collapsing onto the snow-covered road. When I looked back, the tracks were empty. No train, no headlights, just the rusted rails disappearing into the trees. Mark was shaking, his face pale. "Did you see that?" I nodded, unable to speak. We made a pact not to tell anyone. Who would believe us? Two teenagers claiming to have seen a ghost train? But the experience left its mark on both of us. The nightmares started a week later. Every night, I'd find myself back on the tracks, the train barreling toward me, its whistle screaming. The figure would be there, waiting, its glowing eyes boring into me. Mark had the same dreams. We didn't talk about it much, but I could see it in his eyes. He was just as haunted as I was. Then, one night, Mark disappeared. They found his body a week later, lying on the tracks just outside the woods. The coroner said he'd died of hypothermia, but the strange part was the look on his face, his eyes wide with terror. his mouth frozen in a silent scream. After that, I couldn't stay in town. The tracks, the woods, even the snow felt like they were watching me. I moved away, cutting all ties, trying to forget. But the dreams never stopped. It's been 10 years, and I still hear the whistle, sometimes faint and distant, calling me back. I know the train is waiting for me, and I know that one day I won't be able to run. It was January, one of those bleak, freezing nights when the wind howled like a living thing. I had just moved into a small rental house on the edge of a quiet town, trying to start over after a rough breakup. The house was old, creaky, but affordable, a perfect fit for someone trying to save money and lay low for a while. The snowstorm that night was relentless. I could barely see out the windows, the glass frosted over and the view beyond obscured by swirling white. I was curled up on the couch with a blanket, sipping tea and trying to convince myself the old radiator would eventually heat the place. That's when I heard the knock. At first I thought it was just the wind, branches hitting the side of the house or something falling off the porch. But it came again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, louder this time. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Who would be out in a storm like this? Cautiously, I approached the door. The porch light wasn't working, so I had to rely on the dim glow of my phone's flashlight. The knocking came again, more insistent now. I peered through the peephole. There was a man standing on the porch. He was tall and thin, his face pale and gaunt, with sharp cheekbones and hollow eyes that seemed too large for his face. He wasn't wearing a coat, just a threadbare sweater and slacks, his hair plastered to his skull by the snow. He looked directly at the peephole, as if he could see me through it. "Can you help me?" he said, his voice muffled by the door. I hesitated. Something about him felt wrong. He didn't shiver or seem affected by the cold at all, despite the brutal weather. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice shaking. "I can't let you in." "Please," he said, his tone calm but insistent. "I just need to come inside for a moment. It's so cold out here." I stepped back from the door, my instincts screaming at me to keep it shut. "I can call for help," I offered. "Do you need me to call someone?" There was a long pause. Then, slowly, the man leaned closer to the peephole. His lips stretched into a thin smile, and he said, "I don't need help. I just need you to let me in." I stumbled back, my heart racing. Something about his voice was unnatural now, too smooth, too even, like a recording played on repeat. The knocking started again, harder this time. The whole door rattled in its frame, the sound echoing through the house. "Let me in," he said, his voice louder, more forceful. "It's so cold out here." I grabbed my phone and called the police, my hands trembling as I dialed. The dispatcher answered, her voice calm and professional. "There's a man on my porch," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "He's banging on my door and asking to come inside. He doesn't look right. Please, can you send someone?" The dispatcher asked for my address, then assured me officers were on their way. She told me to stay on the line, but as I turned back toward the door, I realized the knocking had stopped. I moved closer, my phone still pressed to my ear, and peeked through the peephole again. The man was gone. I stayed on the line with the dispatcher until the police arrived. 2 officers knocked on the door and I let them in, explaining what had happened. They searched the property, shining their flashlights into the snow-covered yard and around the perimeter of the house. After about 20 minutes, they came back inside, shaking their heads. "There's no sign of anyone," one of them said. "No footprints in the snow. No tracks leading away from the porch. Are you sure someone was here?" I nodded, my stomach twisting. "I saw him. He knocked on the door. He spoke to me." The officers exchanged a glance, then one of them said, "It's possible the storm covered his tracks, but if you see him again, call us right away." They left shortly after, leaving me alone in the silent house. I tried to convince myself it was over, that the man had moved on or been driven away by the storm. But as the hours passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow flickering just beyond the window, or a shape shifting in the snow. Around midnight, I heard the knock again. This time, it wasn't on the front door. It was on the window. I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears. Slowly, I turned toward the sound. The curtains were drawn, but I could see a faint silhouette behind, a tall, thin figure standing perfectly still. "Let me in," the man's voice called, muffled by the glass. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, shaking the window pane. "Let me in," he repeated, his voice sharper now, filled with an edge of anger. I grabbed the phone to call the police again, but before I could dial, the knocking stopped. When I pulled the curtain back, there was nothing there, just the empty yard, the snow falling steadily. But in the frost on the glass, someone had written 3 words, "Let me in." I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of the living room, clutching a kitchen knife, jumping at every creak and groan of the house. By morning, the storm had passed. The sun rose, casting long shadows across the snow-covered yard. I thought about leaving, packing up and driving away, but something kept me rooted there. That evening, as the light faded and the cold crept back in, I noticed something strange. The words written on the window were gone. In their place, scratched into the frost, were new words. You will let me in. I moved out the next day, leaving everything behind. I never told anyone what happened, not the landlord, not the police. Some things are better left unsaid. But sometimes, on cold January nights, I hear knocking at the window, and deep down, I know he's still waiting. It was the kind of January night that made you question your sanity for living in the Midwest. The wind howled like a banshee, and the snow fell in thick sheets, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. I was driving back from my parents' house, regretting my decision to stay so late. The storm had worsened quickly, and now the 2-hour drive home felt like an eternity. The roads were empty, blanketed in snow. My car's tires crunched along the unplowed highway, the headlights barely cutting through the swirling white. The radio was static, and my phone had no signal. I told myself it was just a typical winter storm, but the growing unease in my chest said otherwise. I was alone, or so I thought. About 30 minutes into the drive, I saw something in the distance, a figure standing by the side of the road. At first, I thought it might be a deer or some kind of animal, but as I got closer, I realized it was a person, a man, dressed in a long coat and hat, his face obscured by the falling snow. He stood perfectly still, not moving an inch. Even as my car approached, I slowed down, the cautious part of me wondering if he needed help. But something about him made me hesitate. He didn't wave or signal for me to stop. He just stood there, facing the road, his head tilted slightly as if watching me. The moment my car passed him, my headlights flickered. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but the figure was gone. A shiver ran down my spine. I told myself he must have stepped off the road, hidden by the snow, but the image of him standing so unnaturally still wouldn't leave my mind. I drove on, gripping the wheel tightly. The snowstorm seemed to intensify, the wind shaking the car as it howled across the plains. My wipers struggled to keep the windshield clear, and the cold seeped into the car no matter how high I turned the heat. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible over the storm. At first I thought it was the wind, but it came again, clearer this time, soft, deliberate, and chillingly close. Let me in. I froze, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror. The back seat was empty, but the whisper came again, louder now. Let me in. My heart pounded as I checked the locks on the doors. They were all secure, but the whisper didn't stop. It was relentless, a voice that seemed to echo inside my skull. Let me in. I pressed the accelerator, desperate to get away from whatever was happening. The car sped down the icy road, the tires slipping slightly, but I didn't care. I just needed to get home. The whispering grew louder, almost like a chant now, overlapping voices filling the car. My chest tightened with panic, my breaths coming in short gasps. Suddenly, the car skidded. I lost control, the wheels sliding across the icy road. The car spun once, twice, before slamming into a snowbank. The impact jolted me forward, the seatbelt digging into my chest. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, I saw them. Figures emerged from the snow, their outlines barely visible in the storm. There were 3 of them, dressed in dark, tattered clothing that flapped in the wind. Their faces were pale, almost glowing, and their eyes were black pits that seemed to suck in the light. They surrounded the car, moving slowly but deliberately, their gazes fixed on me. The whispering started again, louder now, coming from all directions. Let us in. I fumbled with the keys, trying to restart the engine, but the car wouldn't budge. The figures were closer now, their faces pressed against the windows, leaving trails of frost where their breath touched the glass. Let us in. One of them placed a hand on the driver's side window. Its fingers were unnaturally long, tipped with black, claw-like nails. The glass began to crack under the pressure. Desperate, I grabbed my phone, hoping against hope for a signal. To my shock, the screen lit up. 1 bar. I dialed 911, my hands shaking so badly, I almost dropped the phone. The operator answered, her voice calm and professional. 911. What's your emergency? There's someone outside my car, I stammered. They're trying to get in. Where are you located? She asked. I gave her the name of the highway and the closest mile marker I could remember. She assured me that help was on the way, but her voice sounded distant, almost distorted. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. Don't let them in. The line went dead. I dropped the phone, my eyes darting to the figures outside. They were still there, but now their faces were distorted, stretched and twisted like melted wax. Their mouths opened impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged black teeth. The cracks in the window deepened, spiderwebbing across the glass. Let us in, they hissed, their voices blending into a single guttural sound. I didn't think. I just acted. Reaching into the glove compartment, I pulled out a small flashlight and shone it directly at the nearest figure. To my surprise, it recoiled, hissing like a wounded animal. The others followed, retreating into the storm. The whispering stopped. For a long moment, I sat there, too terrified to move. Then, in the distance, I saw flashing lights, a snowplow, followed by a police car. The officers helped pull my car out of the snowbank and escorted me home. I didn't tell them about the figures or the whispers. I knew they wouldn't believe me. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, waiting. And every time the wind howls, I swear I can hear them whisper, "Let us in.